Sarvebhyo Namaha. I welcome you all to this 3-day lecture series by Sri Sandeep Balakrishna on a topic of much relevance today. Sandeep will talk to us about one of the greatest historians that our land has seen, Sri Acharya Jadunath Sarkar. And I have great pleasure in inviting and introducing Sri Sandeep Balakrishna to our forum here. Of course, he is no stranger to Gokhale Institute of Public Affairs. Just a few months ago, we had the pleasure and privilege of hearing Sandeep Balakrishna talk to us about another savant, another great son of our country, Sri Sitaram Goel. He delivered the Sitaram Goel Birth Centenary Memorial Lecture, and that talk incidentally drew much wide praise from various learned quarters. So I welcome Sri Sandeep Balakrishna on behalf of the Institute and on behalf of all our listeners who have joined us both physically here and who have logged in online. Sri Sandeep Balakrishna is the founder editor of the immensely popular online portal Dharma Dispatch. He is a scholar of history and writes frequently on various aspects related to Indian cultural heritage and the political happenings both at home and abroad. What marks Sandeep Balakrishna apart from all the regular run of writers is his fearless criticism, and which is based on solid historical evidences, based on our country's historical experiences. And this is the need of the hour, and Sandeep has been doing that job quite admirably from many, many years now. And he is the author of several well-received books. One of the books that he has authored quite recently is Invaders and Infidels, which is a narrative of sorts of the Islamic conquest of India. It is the first volume and the first of many books in the series. He is also a much sought after translator. He has translated Dr. S.L. Bhairappa's Avarana as the Veil into English, and that has seen numerous reissues, and also his Tabbaliyuni Nade Magane as Orphaned. Sandeep, like I said, is a student of history, is an expounder on history. He has written about various aspects of recent history, such as 70 years of secularism, and about a somewhat neglected aspect of our history, such as the Madurai Sultanate, etc. And Sandeep, with respect to our topic today, Sri Jadunath Sarkar, he is very well suited to talk about him because, one, he holds the subject of this talk with great reverence. He holds Jadunath Sarkar at high esteem, and if a person has natural regard, heartfelt regard for a person, then the talk appears so much more heartfelt, and that is why Sandeep, we feel, is so well suited to give us this talk. I would like to quote just a single passage. In fact, it is just one sentence about Jadunath Sarkar, written about him by a friend of his, by a contemporary, another great historian, G.S. Sardesai. And that, I feel, will set the context for today's talk. Dr. Sardesai says, Jadunath as a historian is not an accident, not a fortunate child of opportunities, but the consummation of a life of preparation, planning, hard industry, and an ascetic devotion to a great mission. And that I think is what Jadunath Sarkar stood for in all his researches on our history, especially related to the medieval Indian chronicle, which has been so much misinterpreted, which has been the butt of so much criticism, etc. So it is all the more important for us to lend our ears to Sandeep Balakrishna's learned exposition. I request him to please give us the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Shashi, for the generous and detailed introduction with a lot of needless exaggerations. So, I really don't know where to begin, so I'll begin with this celebrated Vedic verse. Om Sahana Vavatu, Sahano Bhunaktu, Sahaviryankaravavahai, Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Good evening and a very warm welcome to all of you. And as always, it is an immense delight, a privilege, and a great honor to speak at this sanctified institution established by Sri D.V. Gundappa, one of the rishis of recent history. My joy doubles and my responsibility multiplies when I realize that the topic of this 3-day lecture series is about a true Acharya of Himalayan stature, Sri Jadunath Sarkar. For at least half a century, Jadunath Sarkar was known as the doyen of Indian history. He was celebrated as the greatest living historian of India, and both these honors are actually understatements. Like his illustrious contemporaries in other fields working around the same time, Jadunath Sarkar was one of destiny's favorite children, chosen scholars by destiny, who was born in the era of the modern Indian Renaissance. His service to Indian history and historiography is in the same league as, say, Dr. Pandurang Vaman Kande's service to the field of Dharmashastra, or Professor Mysore Hiriyanna's contributions to Indian philosophy, or Mahamahopadhyaya Ganganath Jha's immortal bequest to the world of our traditional scholarship and translations. And in this connection, it just struck me, I must mention a rather intriguing phenomenon. I think only some kind of magic or divine power can explain the fact that Jadunath Sarkar was born in 1870, Acharya Hiriyanna was also born in 1870, Ganganath Jha was born just 1 year later, 1871, P.V. Kane slightly later in 1880, and our very own D.V. Gundappa was born in 1887. So in less than 20 years, 20 years, this great soil gave birth to such extraordinary stalwarts. And I can add the names of other luminaries of a similar caliber, and the list is quite long. But what they all share is another common trait, which is their immortality through their profound legacy. So I can think of no other befitting way to begin this lecture series than by quoting a timeless verse from the Mahanarayana Upanishad. Yatha vrikshasya sampushpitasya durad gandho vati, evam punyasya karmano durad gandho vati, which basically means that just as a fragrance emanating from the flowers of a tree reaches far and wide, even to people who have not seen the tree, so do the virtues and the good deeds which are done for the welfare of the world by sages spread everywhere. Now, this evocative and beautiful verse, it falls in the realm of space. That is, this verse talks about the fragrance of the flowers of a tree, which is a physical object located on this earth. But our fond reminiscence of Jadunath Sarkar falls in the realm of time today. A reminiscence or memory is a function of time, and the fragrance of Acharya Jadunath Sarkar remains as fresh as it had been when he walked this earth from 1870 and departed it in 1958. And for giving me an opportunity, for facilitating me to share some major highlights of this great stalwart's life, and for celebrating his immortality, I once again offer my heartfelt gratitude to the Gokhale Institute of Public Affairs. Shashi has already given perhaps the best description and summary of Jadunath Sarkar's entire legacy. He has quoted his close friend and fellow scholar of history, a companion for many years, Govind Sakharam Sardesai, and I'll quote again. Jadunath as a historian is not an accident, not a fortunate child of opportunities, but the consummation of a life of preparation, planning, hard industry, and ascetic devotion to a great mission. Truer words could not be written, but we can argue, of course, that Sardesai was heavily biased, and justly so. Biased towards his close friend, but as we shall see over the course of these 3 days, Jadunath Sarkar's fame and legacy have actually outlasted Sardesai's assessment. So, just to give a small example, I'll take a random but contemporary illustration to drive this home. Till date, Jadunath Sarkar's reputation as a towering historian, it rests largely on his contemporary, authoritative and unsurpassed volumes on the history of Aurangzeb. It was precisely these 5 volumes that also became one of the major ingredients for Dr. S.L. Bhairappa's blockbuster novel Avarana. Without exaggeration, it can be said that Jadunath Sarkar's phenomenal body of work on Aurangzeb is one of the strong backbones of Avarana's depiction of the Islamic monster named Aurangzeb. Indeed, Aurangzeb's tyranny, his oppression of Hindus, his large-scale bigotry, temple destructions, his untold cruelty, and in fact, Dr. S.L. Bhairappa's recreation of that specific Mughal period is solidly backed up by Jadunath Sarkar's work. And Dr. Bhairappa himself, very creatively and highly in a very astute manner, Dr. Bhairappa pays a great homage to Jadunath Sarkar within the novel Avarana itself. You must read the climax and other areas to understand Dr. Bhairappa's craft and art. So from one perspective, this is a superb phenomenon in which Shastra, in this case Shastra means history, has been used with such creative brilliance in Kavya or literature. And Jadunath Sarkar's very first work on Aurangzeb was published in 1901, while Avarana came out in 2007, that is after 106 years. This itself is an extraordinary testimony to this great Acharya's durable scholarship. And in our own time, Jadunath Sarkar was a household name. Rather, in his time, Jadunath Sarkar was a household name and he was widely recognized as one of the great cultural icons of his era. And this itself, in turn, speaks volumes about the culture and social climate of India just 60 or 70 years ago. This was a climate in which the whole Indian society genuinely looked up and respected scholars and poets and intellectuals and regarded them as ideals worthy to be followed instead of the current phenomenon of chasing celebrities and film stars. But this social and climate, scholarly climate, had another facet, another context as well. Today, it might be surprising for a lot of people to know that even in the early or mid 1940s, there were less than 15 universities in entire India, including what is today known as Pakistan and Bangladesh. Less than 15 universities. I think the number is about 8 or 9. Yet, all of them produce scholars of extraordinary caliber and eminence who went on to attain global fame. Today, we have thousands of universities, but how many of them have produced even a fraction of Jadunath Sarkar's eminence? So this is the real downfall after India attained a questionable independence. But I'll take up this point in an indirect fashion much later as we go on. And like his peers and contemporaries of the modern Indian Renaissance, Jadunath Sarkar also was a well-rounded scholar. He was deeply learned in an impressive range of academic disciplines and was also a polyglot. However, he voluntarily restricted himself, or rather, he dedicated his whole life to the study of history, and we must explore his legacy as such. That is from that perspective. And ideally, I think the method for doing this kind of exploration must resemble an elaborate raga lapana in a deliberate, slow and systematic fashion, showing the full beauty of the raga by showcasing its various aspects and aesthetic beauty. And accordingly, I have broadly divided this lecture series into the following headings. They are interchangeable, but just to give an overall summary, here goes. Jadunath Sarkar's family background, his early life, his childhood, his initial school education, his higher education, and his early career as an academic, how he got interested in history, and a detailed story of how he actually wrote his magnum opus on Aurangzeb in 5 volumes, and also another similar magnum opus, this time the history of the Mughal empires in 4 volumes, and his valuable contributions to the history of Shivaji and the Maratha Empire, and followed by a brief look at other major works of historical scholarship. After this, I'll also talk about some delightful and really inspirational facets of his method of scholarship, how he actually approached his method of working, his dedication, and other things. And a detailed look at his legacy, extraordinary legacy as a true guru and acharya. His house, both in Patna, in Calcutta, and in Darjeeling, resembled a Gurukula. And I'll give you substantial details. It's very inspiring and moving as well. Then we'll look at some glimpses and anecdotes of his personality, his temperament and quirks, and his character. And we'll also look at a separate section. In a separate section, we'll look at his lasting friendship with G.S. Sardesai. And finally, I'll give a few anecdotes and narratives about his personal life and his last days. So this kind of sets the tone for what will follow. Fortunately, I didn't have to work too hard for this lecture, because we have substantial information to actually write a full-fledged and an independent biography of Jadunath Sarkar. There is enough material. And although we have some notable books that have come out in recent times, none of them have actually given us comprehensive biography in that sense. And with these words, we can dive right into the early life of Acharya Jadunath Sarkar. Jadunath Sarkar's story actually begins with the British conquest of Bengal. And this conquest, in turn, began with the history-altering Battle of Palashi in 1757. Palashi is known as the Battle of Plassey. Plassey is a corruption of the word Palashi, which comes from Palasha Vriksha. The name of the city is derived from that. So Palashi is located about 200 kilometers from Kolkata. It lies today in Nadia district or Navadvipa, an ancient seat of Sanskrit learning. And the most significant outcome of the Battle of Palashi was the impact that it had on the Hindu population of Bengal at that time. That is in the mid-18th century. And when I say Bengal, it includes today's Bangladesh and some bordering cities and towns of Bihar. For about 2 centuries, the Mughal governors in Bengal had heartlessly extorted and terrorized the Hindus there. And when Siraj-ud-Dawla became the Nawab of Bengal, the Hindus there were desperately looking for a savior from all this tyranny. And so when the British defeated Siraj-ud-Dawla in the Battle of Palashi, they were regarded as liberators. I'll give you a small example to give this context. We have a beautiful and a rather eye-opening biography of a king named Maharaja Navakrishna Dev Bahadur. He had played an active role in defeating Siraj-ud-Dawla. He started off as an accountant and of the East India Company, and was promoted due to his talent. So he played an active role in defeating Siraj-ud-Dawla, and his biography gives us an idea of how the Bengali Hindus saw the British as heroes and liberators who had finally saved them from centuries of Muslim tyranny. And I will give a small passage from Navakrishna's biography, and I quote, "The hope of the devout Hindu is in the European. The hope of the devout Hindu is in the European. The Hindu may be pardoned if he flatters himself that it was a divine regard for Hindu interests that made Britain's banners float on Indian soil. he would have been swept away under the old Muslim rule, but he was saved under the new rule. God had listened to the Hindus' prayers. His dharma and his creed and his country had been saved by the European. Close quote. I have no words, but when we read this today, and even as I'm, reading it out, a mixture of emotions surfaces within us: pain, pathos, pity, and shame. Pain, pathos, and pity at the unremitting suffering that the Hindus of Bengal had to endure for several centuries. Shame at how they regarded yet another invader, this time the European, as their savior. And at the root of all these emotions is just one psychological condition. It has a word: demoralization. This is exactly what Jadunath Sarkar himself described when he wrote these words, and I quote again: when a class of men like Hindus is publicly depressed and harassed as under the Muslim rule, it merely contents itself with dragging on an animal existence. The Hindus could not be expected to produce the best of what they were really capable. Close quote. Now let's return to the story of Maharaja Navakrishna Dev. After he was appointed as the Maharaja by the East India Company, it was Navakrishna Dev who first initiated the fabulous Durga Puja, which is still celebrated as a public festival throughout Bengal. This is the origin of the Durga Pujo festival that happens during Navaratri. And Lokamanya Tilak was inspired precisely by this example to start the Ganeshotsava in Maharashtra as a public festival to bind and unite the Hindus together against the British rule. But in the 18th century, Bengal was not alone in regarding the British as liberators and saviors. We have the example of our own Mysore state. As you all know here, it was the courage of Maharani Lakshmi Ammanni and others in the Mysore royal family which restored the Mysore kingdom back to the Wadiyar dynasty and with British help. And she also played a key role in liberating, this Hindu kingdom from the twin tyrannies of Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan, the tyrant of Mysore. Now the British might have liberated the Bengali Hindus, but in the process, they had also inaugurated an irreversible colonization of the Hindu mind. And it is not a coincidence that the first loss of Hindu cultural self-confidence began in Bengal. And in just one century, that is from 1757, and by 1857, that is around the first war of Indian independence, an influential section of the Bengali Hindus was slowly becoming westernized. Sorry. In fact, the 1857 War of Independence was the last fully homegrown resistance against yet another alien rule. And the Indian freedom struggle that happened after 1857 was largely modeled on ideas and methods borrowed from Europe. Another sannyasi rebellion could never emerge after this revolt, this war of 1857 was crushed. So they were modeled on ideas, methods, and techniques borrowed from Europe, and its greatest champion was the Indian National Congress, again founded by an Englishman named A.O. Hume. But simultaneously, something else was also happening in the non-political field. The period after 1857 also marked the beginning of the modern Indian Renaissance, which I just spoke about. And one major objective of this Renaissance was to recover, renew, and rejuvenate the battered and forgotten Hindu civilizational genius. And it arose in the same Bengal, which was the first victim of British cultural colonization. In fact, this Renaissance had, by the 1870s, this Renaissance had become such a tidal wave which birthed immortal cultural and spiritual icons like Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, Swami Vivekananda, Sharat Chandra Chattopadhyaya, Sri Aurobindo, and countless others. And together and separately, they hit back at this colonization process. And by the end of this 19th century, English schools and colleges in Bengal were denounced as Ghulam Khanas, meaning factories producing slaves for the British Empire. So this was the impact this Renaissance had, especially in Bengal. And it was in this larger socio-political climate that a man named Rajkumar Sarkar passed his entrance exam, what is known as a matriculation examination, exactly in the year 1857 in a small town named Rajshahi, located in North Bengal. And 1857 was also the year in which the Calcutta University was founded. Rajkumar Sarkar was born in an extremely wealthy zamindar family. It was an ancestral Kayastha family which followed the Bengali Vaishnava Pantha. Rajkumar Sarkar had passed the exam with flying colors, but destiny had brutally cut short his promising academic career because his father had suddenly died and he had left behind the burden of managing a large ancestral estate on this boy's tender shoulders. A lot of disputes were there, a lot of court cases were there, and it was a large family. And Rajkumar Sarkar, at the tender age of 16 or 17, he did not disappoint his dead father. He abandoned his studies and, with the zeal and passion of his youth, secured his vast family fortune, cleared up all the court cases, and eventually married a girl, Srimati Hari Sundari, who was a devout Hindu wife. Over time, she was honored as Ratnagarbha, or the jeweled womb that gave birth to 10 children, 7 sons and 3 daughters. Acharya Jadunath Sarkar was a third son, born on 10th December 1870 in the Margashira Masa, Krishna Paksha Dvitiya on Shanivara. And the place of her delivery was a village named Karachmariya in Rajshahi, which is now unfortunately located in Bangladesh. And as a child, Jadunath Sarkar was his mother's favorite, and there are a lot of delightful anecdotes about this. I'll just narrate a couple. So as a kid, Jadunath occupied the place nearest to his mother while going to sleep at night. But the small boy, when he was deep in sleep, the small boy would kick his mother while he was fast asleep, and eventually he got a severe warning that if his legs touched her body again, he would be made to sleep far away from her. But even at that young age, Jadunath Sarkar was made up of shrewd determination. So from the next night onwards, he tied both his legs to the bedstead with a bedsheet, manchad kalige antaralla, adakke bedsheet sutkondo, he retained his coveted place close to his mother. And Srimati Hari Sundari, she later, told her grandsons that this naughty boy, Jadunath Sarkar, used to run to her, in the middle of playing games or, while studying, for getting pampered. Her tode mel kootkondo buddu madiskoldu ivella aittu. She describes that in the way only a mother can. And Srimati Hari Sundari, an extremely virtuous lady, she lived till the ripe old age of 94, and she passed away in 1939. Jadunath Sarkar had his Aksharabhyasa when he was just 4 years old, and his tiny fingers traced the Bengali alphabet after being ceremonially initiated into studies. Now, although Jadunath belonged to a typical Bengali zamindari family, his large home was an abode of devotion, spirituality, culture, refinement, learning and scholarship. And this solemn atmosphere left a deep imprint on him, and it sculpted his entire life. His father, Rajkumar Sarkar, had merely stopped going to school and college, but he had not stopped educating himself. And the son, Jadunath, imbibed all the best qualities of this stately and profound man: simple living, plain but clean dressing, frugal food habits, a spirit of charity and public service, and a lifelong devotion to books and learning. And I will quote a couple of lines. It is very beautiful, gives a very beautiful description of Rajkumar Sarkar. Quote, "A stern moralist and a man of frugal habits, Babu Rajkumar Sarkar kept a well-regulated household free from the concomitant vices of unearned income, unrestrained license, and untamed passions that prevailed in an average zamindar's house of those days. Close quote. But above all, Rajkumar Sarkar had several other profound facets to his character. He was one of the early children of the Indian Renaissance, born under the impact of the West or during the initial impact of the British conquest. He built an impressive family library and stocked it with the best books of Indian and English literature, science, history, and mathematics and other subjects. He also carefully purchased and preserved all the issues of magazines like the Hindu Patriot, the Amrita Bazar Patrika, and tens of special interest journals and magazines. And in Jadunath Sarkar's eyes, Rajkumar Sarkar was a noble model of a scholar and a savant, and he owed his interest in history to his father. And I'll narrate that story in a little bit. Rajkumar Sarkar, this amazing man, he passed away on 18 July 1914 after living a long and fruitful life numbering 74 years, and happily he lived to witness the rising eminence of his illustrious son, because just 2 years before his death, Jadunath Sarkar had published 2 volumes of his Magnum opus, The History of Aurangzeb. And till the very end of his life, Jadunath Sarkar preserved the inspirational memory of his father like a sacred treasure. Okay, now Jadunath Sarkar spent his boyhood in the tranquil rural ambience of Karachmaria. That is also, we have several anecdotes and we'll look at it as we go on. Although his father could afford an army of private tutors, Jadunath was compulsorily sent to the rural village school and he took his early education in Bengali. This is in clear contrast to Nawab Nehru, who was indeed schooled by an army of private tutors, mostly in Persian, English, and French. In a way, this also describes the yawning difference between the two men, but that is, we won't look at that. So when Jadunath was just 7 years old, he was enrolled in the collegiate school in Rajshahi, but after 1 year, he was shifted to Calcutta under the guardianship of his elder brother. And when Jadunath was 11 years old, he returned again to Rajshahi and was now enrolled in the Rajshahi High School. And in 1887, Jadunath passed his matriculation exam with high distinction and he got a first grade scholarship. The bud had just burst into a tender blossom. Jadunath Sarkar was that precious flower whose full bloom never withered, and this lecture series is simply the latest proof that its fragrance, as I said, remains immortal. 2 years later, that is in 1889, he cleared his intermediate exam, that is PUC, with flying colors and earned another first grade scholarship. Ivathin scholarship alladu. And I'll explain how the atmosphere, the academic atmosphere of those of that period. Jadunath's entire student life in Rajshahi till he passed his intermediate exam, it was largely in tune with our traditional approach. He was given minimal comforts at home and even in school and college, even though he belonged to a wealthy zamindari family, and the only sweet that he was allowed to eat was something called the do paki mudki, which means parched rice. Avalakkina ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ ಬೆಲ್ಲದಲ್ಲಿ ಅಥವಾ ಶುಗರ್ ಕೇನಲ್ಲಿ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿ ಕುದಿಸಿ ಮಾಡಿರೋ ಸ್ವೀಟು. ಸೊ ದೋ ಮುದ್ಕಿ ಪಾಕಿ, and entertainment of any sort was strictly forbidden. This also has a slight family history. Jadunath Sarkar's great-grandfather had embraced the Vaishnava Pantha founded by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And the family deity of Sarkar lineage, of the Sarkar lineage, was no longer Kali, but Krishna, after, his great-grandfather. And this man gave away all the swords which he had kept in his house for generations as a tradition. And at Durga Puja, his family would worship all these swords. And next, this man banned meat, eggs, onion, and garlic from the family kitchen. So, as a student, it was only studies and more studies for Jadunath Sarkar, and like I said, no distractions were allowed. But interestingly, his family actively encouraged Jadunath to attend public lectures at a place called the Rajshahi Dharma Sabha. It was a dharmic organization that regularly conducted, programs like discourses and lectures in order to foster and sustain a spiritual atmosphere in the village. Jadunath was so mesmerized by the oratory, by the passion, by the bhakti, devotion, and eloquence of the Pandits who gave their discourses, and he drank deeply from the waters of Yamuna of Vaishnava Bhakti and Shastra that flowed in Karachmariya. And in this simple village, Shri Krishna was worshipped as Gopinatha, or the Lord of Gopis, and bhajans and kirtans were conducted almost on a daily basis. Every evening, Gopinatha sprang alive in the verses of the Bhagavata, Bhagavad Gita, Vishnu Purana, Harivamsha, and the poetry of Jayadeva and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. All these formative experiences left an indelible influence in Jadunath's life and eventually led him to translate the Bengali work Chaitanya Charitamrita into English. It was titled as Chaitanya's Life and Teachings, and he dedicated this work to Rajagopalachari, and I quote the words from his dedication. Quote, "To Professor Rajagopalacharya, who has done so much to make the Vaishnava saints of the South known to us, I dedicate this attempt to place the original life of Chaitanya, the greatest Vaishnava teacher of the North, within the reach of all readers of English who know not the Bengali tongue." Close quote. So, after his intermediate or PUC, Jadunath Sarkar was admitted to the Eden Hindu Hostel in Calcutta in 1889. He enrolled for a BA degree in the Presidency College, Calcutta. And there, he developed a love for playing football. Remember, this is the same man who, as a child, had tied his legs to a bedstead. So he developed an interest as a teenager, developed a love for playing football, but he played the game more to improve his health and physical fitness than as a passion or hobby. And in the hostel, Jadunath Sarkar kept a personal kerosene stove. He prepared halwa for his breakfast, and he cooked sea crabs to supplement the hostel food, which was pretty bad. And the monthly cost of his education was just 12 rupees. This is in 1889. And this cost included hostel fees, medical assistance, and 2 full meals every day. And much later, Jadunath Sarkar's favorite student, who was also an eminent scholar, his name is Kwanungo, he described the educational climate of that era as follows, and it is quite striking, and allinda ಎಷ್ಟು ದೂರ ಬಂದಿದ್ದೀವಿ ಅಂತ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗುತ್ತೆ. Quote, "In the Calcutta of those days, there were no distractions to divert the mind of the students from study. No irresponsible politicians dished out extremism and defiance of discipline. No movies to play havoc with the morals of the youngsters. There were theaters, but these were not frequented except by abandoned characters and the black sheep of colleges. Students did not have to spend much money on clothes. A dhoti, a shirt, and a china coat was considered as decent dress. Politics and cinema stars, smoking and gossip were not the usual relaxations of students in those days as they are in ours. Professors, teachers, probable questions in the coming examinations, these were the absorbing topics of the evening conversations of students. Jadunath has not visited even once a professional Bengali theatre since he came to Calcutta in 1889. Close quote. And 2 years later, that is in 1891, Jadunath passed his BA exam with double honors in English and history, which was actually a rare achievement in those days. And this time, he got a monthly scholarship of 50 rupees, which was a large sum in those days. But even before he took the BA exam, Jadunath wrote a learned article titled The Fall of Tipu Sultan in the quarterly journal named Suhrat, which was published by the Eden Hindu Hostel. I have been desperately trying to find this article and have been unsuccessful so far, and I will be deeply grateful to anyone who can locate it. So this is a public request. So Jadunath immediately enrolled for his MA degree after BA honors. MA was just a one-year course for students who did honors in those days. Interestingly, his MA, he enrolled, his subject was not history but English literature. And when the results of the MA exam came out in 1892, Jadunath Sarkar stunned the whole university by smashing all its previous records. He had notched up 90, 92 and 95% in 3 subjects and slightly less in other subjects. And when I say slightly less, it means a number above 85%. His aggregate score was 90%, but above all, Jadunath had directly humbled the British by scoring 95% in English literature and language. The imperial language, their own language, the language of the ruling class in which they took arrogant pride. And it was, after all, it was Macaulay who had boasted that all of India's so-called literature was not worth a single shelf of a library in Europe. So Jadunath had hit them with their own stick or whatever you want to call it, gun or whatever. But to their credit, the British government also recognized his academic brilliance and offered him a generous scholarship to pursue higher studies in England. But Jadunath had to decline the offer due to personal reasons. We don't know what those reasons are, but he had to decline it. But had he accepted the offer, he would have become an ICS officer, and his ICS classmate in England would have been Sri Aurobindo Ghosh. This loss to the Indian civil service was a permanent gain to Indian history. And the next great milestone in Jadunath Sarkar's early academic career was his decision to prepare for something called the Premchand Roychand Scholarship. And this decision completely changed the direction of his distinguished life. Premchand Roychand was a Jain businessman who had amassed an enormous fortune by trading in wholesale cotton, and he went on to found numerous other businesses, and he was nicknamed as the Cotton King, as the Bullion King, and the Stock Market King of Bombay. He was a predecessor to other, big names in stock market. But Premchand Roychand also dedicated a small part of this enormous fortune to several charitable activities. And one such activity, one such charity, was an endowment of 2 lakh rupees. 2 lakh in 1886. An endowment of 2 lakh rupees to the Calcutta University, and this was the Premchand Roychand Scholarship, founded in 1886. The interest from this corpus of endowment, it would be given as an award to a scholar of exceptional merit in 3 installments. The first installment, student would be given 10,000, second 8,000, and third was 7,000. The qualifications for this scholarship were extremely demanding, and I'll just give a few tidbits of the qualifications, what the standards that a student had to meet. So the aspirant had to pass through a series of rigorous written examinations at regular intervals. The student was also tested on other criteria. For example, he should have demonstrated an immense capacity for focused research, an extensive reading, a strong memory, and proficiency in multiple languages. Its subjects included history, economics, political science, and the English language. But there's more. There were also extensive courses attached to each of these subjects, and I'll just give 2 small examples. For example, the English paper included thorough courses on English philology, prose, verse, and the complete history of the English language, beginning with the Anglo-Saxon period. These were papers if you took the English course. Likewise, if you took history, a deep study of Indian history was mandatory from the primary sources written in their original languages, Sanskrit, Prakrit, Pali, Kannada, Telugu, Tamil, Farsi, and so on. But to make it worse, no limits were set for the examiners in prescribing questions. But there's still more, I'm not done. The Premchand Roychand scholarship examination was so tough that in some years, no scholar was deemed eligible to receive the prize. Lapse ಆಗ್ತಾಯಿತ್ತು. I'll give you one example to illustrate this. You had a distinguished scholar named Gurudas Banerjee who prepared and took the Roychand scholarship exam, and he came second place. The scholarship was refused to him. No second prize. Bandre ಒಂದೇ. So Gurudas Banerjee eventually went on to become the judge of the Calcutta High Court. He was also the first Indian Vice Chancellor of the University of Calcutta, and one of the most decorated recipients of the Premchand Roychand scholarship was Shri Ashutosh Mukherjee, who was the father of Shri Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, the founder of the Bharatiya Janasangh. And Jadunath Sarkar chose this coveted scholarship as his target. So, not only that, he simultaneously took a job as an English lecturer at the Ripon College in Calcutta, and this is a delightful episode in itself. In the last week of June 1893, Jadunath Sarkar stood alone outside the classroom of the final year BA with a book in his hand. It was his first day as lecturer. A student named Sharat Chandra Sharma, he saw Jadunath and he mistook him as a first year student. So even before he could strike up a conversation, even before he could talk to Jadunath, the bell rang and Sharat Chandra and other students, all of them rushed into the class. 1 minute later, Jadunath Sarkar walked into the class with a dignified gait. He climbed up and stood on the podium and opened the very first lecture of his life. 5 minutes later, the whole class was spellbound by his confidence, his eloquence, and the sheer range of his erudition. And the class had become an enthralled mass of mutes 5 more minutes later. And by the end of the period, whispers went around the class. Exactly who was this new boy? Who was this new lecturer? And the question was answered soon enough. Thanks to the studenthood fame, which had outpaced Jadunath Sarkar even before he became a lecturer. As I said, the fragrance of the flower precedes it. And it was revealed that he was none other than Jadunath Sarkar, the intellectual prodigy who was admired and envied by the student community at Presidency College and elsewhere. And now he was their lecturer. And this was the very first day of his career. After this, Jadunath joined the Vidyasagar College, again in Calcutta, and he worked there from 1896 to 98, even as he was preparing for the Premchand Roychand scholarship, a full-time job. And the story of his preparation itself is a feast of inspiration. It is also a fine model for how one should pursue the unattached quest for knowledge. This is also narrated by his close friend, the same G.S. Sardesai, with intense feeling. And Sardesai, incidentally, was not only elder to Jadunath Sarkar by 5 years, he was also an accomplished scholar in his own right. And I will quote only a small excerpt just to give a flavor. Quote, Jadunath possessed special aptitude for such a hard test. From the beginning, he was given to books and completely avoided publicity. With a rare fondness for reading, he was well learned in English and Sanskrit. Close quote. This is a very good segue for what follows in the next section of today's session. And this relates directly to the writing of the volumes, the 5 volumes on Aurangzeb, which was his magnum opus. Now, one of the conditions of the Premchand Roychand scholarship, it stated that Jadunath Sarkar had to do original research and he had to submit an original thesis in an unexplored area in the history of medieval India. And so, because Jadunath had taken history. And so, when Jadunath Sarkar surveyed the whole scene to select a topic, vast possibilities opened up before him, and his basic temperament, and I'll describe that tomorrow and day after. His basic temperament naturally rejected the nascent areas of archaeology, epigraphy, and numismatics. He found them dry. In his time, the study of ancient India using all these sources, all these evidences, the study of ancient India, it was still an evolving discipline with far too many gaps and many dark corners to offer a conclusive thesis. Plus, there were already too many scholars involved in the field, and so after much thinking, Jadunath selected the early Mughal period as his topic. The decision was also based on the availability of a huge wealth of primary sources, and it was also a virgin field for discovering more new raw material. But as Jadunath progressed further in his research, he realized that the field was extremely vast and wide, and much work had already been done by established scholars like Henry Beveridge. He could probably offer nothing new or original on his own, and this was Jadunath's reasoning. And that was exactly when Aurangzeb caught Jadunath Sarkar's attention. And to his surprise and joy, Jadunath found that no scholar had attempted a scholarly investigation into the life of this Islamic tyrant in the last 150 years. So Aurangzeb died in 1707, and Jadunath began his work in the late 19th century. So in the last 150 years, no scholarly work had been undertaken about Aurangzeb, but there is a highly interesting side to this as well. Until Acharya Jadunath Sarkar entered the scene, only two Hindus had written about Aurangzeb, like I said, in the last 150 years. The first was a man named Ishwar Das Nagar. He wrote a book called Persian book called Futuhat-e-Alamgiri, and the second was a man named Bhimsen Burhanpuri, another Hindu. He wrote another Persian work titled Nushka-e-Dilkusha. And both these Hindus were officials employed by Aurangzeb. They were basically servants of Aurangzeb's administration. And their works were not history in the real sense, but hagiographies meant to please the Mughal emperor. And Jadunath Sarkar had indeed discovered a virgin gold mine, and he decided to excavate it to the fullest extent. But he also understood the enormity of the task that he had set for himself, because almost all the primary sources related to Aurangzeb and that period, all these sources were available in Persian and Marathi. And Jadunath Sarkar did not know both these languages. But if this challenge was formidable, this Acharya's preparation to meet it was equally strenuous and well planned. And he approached the whole endeavor with a sense of planned dynamism and meticulous zeal, and he executed it like a seasoned military general. To study Aurangzeb, you had to imbibe Aurangzeb. So, first Jadunath Sarkar learned Persian starting from the alphabet, Akaradinda, under the guidance of a Maulana, an Islamic scholar located in Patna. His patience and diligence and study produced the expected result, and in a very short duration, Jadunath Sarkar was able to decode Persian chronicles in their manuscript form. And much later in life, Jadunath became one of the most acknowledged experts in the Persian language. He also translated various Persian books and chronicles into English and Bengali, and scholars throughout India and Europe sought his guidance to decipher difficult Persian records and manuscripts. But back to our story, Jadunath next began to collect materials related to Aurangzeb, and in the process, he discovered hundreds, if not thousands, of important Persian manuscripts located both in India and Europe. In India, it was in Delhi, Rampur, Lahore, Hyderabad, the Hyderabad in Pakistan and in India, and other important centers of Mughal political power. And then he also secured valuable material in the India office at London, in the British Museum, in the Bodleian Library, in museums and institutes and universities in Paris and Lisbon. But the remarkable, fact about this backbreaking endeavor is that Jadunath obtained copies of all these manuscripts located in Europe especially by paying money from his own pocket. And one of the most important discoveries of this extensive archaeology was the discovery of a treasure of Aurangzeb's letters in his own hand. But no institution would give permission to take copies of these letters. So what did Jadunath do? He hired copyists, he sent them to all those places, he paid them salary, and they copied out the texts and gave it to him. ಎಷ್ಟು ಜನ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ ಈ ಥರ ಕೆಲಸ? But in the interim, as he was doing all this work, Jadunath sat for the Premchand Roychand scholarship, remember? He sat for that exam and he sailed through it with a breeze. He won the prize in 1897 after 5 years of sustained and backbreaking scholarly work. It got him a gold medal and a cash award, as I said, would be paid in 3 installments. And the final installment would be paid to Jadunath only after he submitted his original thesis on Aurangzeb. And finally, in 1901, Jadunath Sarkar submitted the printed and beautifully bound copy of his thesis. This was titled India of Aurangzeb, its Statistics, Topography and Roads. It was a treatise, not a thesis. And it was path-breaking and comprehensive, giving minute details of roads, including names of roads, battlefields, statistics, huge amounts of data, raw data, and elaborate tables providing various details of Aurangzeb's administration. And we notice several picturesque glimpses of this administrative setup in the character of Hamdullah and Khwaja Jahan in Dr. S.L. Bhairappa's Avarana. Raw material idikke Jadunath Sarkar thesis. And after 9 years of intense penance, Acharya Jadunath Sarkar had produced a blockbuster, and it hit the academic world like a storm, surprising and stunning both his peers and seniors. And the work was immediately lauded as a model of neat and exact scholarship. But Jadunath Sarkar had unconsciously achieved another feat with this work, and this he had done without his active knowledge or ambition. Without that, he had become a pioneer in the field. In the terminology of Boy Scouts, a pioneer is a person who carves out a path from the scratch and shows the way to other people. And Jadunath Sarkar had pioneered this way, not just once with his thesis on Aurangzeb, but repeatedly on multiple occasions throughout his life, and we shall see later in this lecture series. And with the publication of India of Aurangzeb, Jadunath Sarkar had permanently cemented his eminence as a historian to reckon with. India of Aurangzeb also did 2 other things. One, from that point onwards, Jadunath Sarkar dedicated his life to a study of history, Indian history, and he almost permanently moved away from English literature. And number 2, Aurangzeb became an obsession with Jadunath Sarkar for the quarter of a century, that is 25 years. Unfortunately, I have to narrate a related episode in this connection. Unfortunately, Jadunath Sarkar has not revealed the full story of what actually attracted him to the study of history and how history permanently imprisoned him. My research has yielded only a few broad hints, which I will now summarize. Much later in his life, Jadunath Sarkar delivered a radio lecture in which he spoke about his passion for history, because by then he was a renowned historian, and that is putting it mildly. In that lecture, he said that his father had first kindled a love for history at a very young age, and while he was studying for his BA honors in English literature, it was also compulsory to read the comprehensive history of Europe as well. That is, European history was a subsidiary subject of his English literature course. And the same thing carried over to his MA in English. And as he was studying the history of Europe in a comprehensive fashion, a thrilling world opened itself up to Jadunath Sarkar, and he remarked, and I quote his remark, "It was through the gate of Western history that I had entered the field of research in Indian history." Close quote. He also said that he had to read the historian Leonard Sismondi in order to appreciate the Italian poet Dante in a much better fashion. This is akin to saying that we will be able to appreciate Manu or Yajnavalkya better by reading P.V. Kane's History of Dharmashastra, but we should not take this comparison too far. But we can hazard two guesses as to why Jadunath Sarkar became such a devoted scholar of his history instead of becoming a professor of English literature. The first was his innate temperament as a fierce individualist instead of a contented conformist. The second was a profound impact that the masters of European history left on him while he was still an undergraduate and even a postgraduate student. 19th century Europe was teeming with great stalwarts like Lord Acton, Macaulay, Rank, Maitland, Green, and above all, the titan named Edward Gibbon. Jadunath Sarkar had read all of them, and he felt hypnotized by their erudition, eloquence, power, the force of their expression, and their prose style. And the more he read, the more he surrendered and submitted to them, and eventually became their Ekalavya Shishya. And the final stage in this evolution was that he also wanted to write like them. And history was the field that would give him both that freedom and the opportunity. And no matter how brilliant Jadunath was in English literature, any academic or scholarly work in that field would be derivative at best. And the only way that he could do original work in English literature was to become a litterateur himself. And this was not in Jadunath Sarkar's nature. And history thus became Jadunath Sarkar's not just passion, but a sacred calling. His favorite historian was John Richard Green. He was an acclaimed author of a book titled The Short History of the English People, which was widely acclaimed for several generations. It was made prescribed reading. Nobody reads it anyway. Nobody reads anything anymore. Anyway, so even after Jadunath Sarkar himself became a celebrated historian, even after he had written multiple volumes on Aurangzeb and Mughals and Marathas, even after that, he read aloud several sections from Green's book before he started a new chapter of his own books. ಪ್ರತಿ ಚಾಪ್ಟರ್ ಶುರು ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕಿಂತ ಮುಂಚೆ ಶತಪಥ ಹಾಕ್ಕೊಂಡು he would read aloud. He had memorized all these passages from Green's book. So in that sense, John Green was the muse and the Clio that the historian Sarkar invoked each time. The uncompromising individualist in him enabled Sarkar to remain a detached proponent of historical truths unaffected by academic theories and frameworks which generated seminar papers, not insights. This is a brief story of how Acharya Jadunath Sarkar trained himself and became a self-taught architect who sculpted his historical scholarship with his bare and unaided hands. His history writings are a fine amalgam and demonstrated proofs of his homage to all these stalwarts. Every student who had the fortune of learning directly at the feet of Jadunath Sarkar, they unanimously remember this advice, and I quote. So this is the advice of Jadunath Sarkar. Any specialization which is not broad-based on a decent amount of general knowledge of the subject as a whole is bound to be a miscarriage. Close quote. With that, we can, come to the next section of this exciting story of how Jadunath wrote his volumes on Aurangzeb. So here we have to return once again to Jadunath's career after he won the Premchand Roychand scholarship and published his seminal volumes on Aurangzeb. In 1898, the British government recognized his prodigious talent and it recruited him for something called the Provincial Educational Service, like the Education Ministry of today. So Jadunath became a professor of English in Presidency College, in the same college he had studied. He became a professor of English, and he was later transferred to the Patna College after a year. And 3 years later, Presidency College recalled him. So there was a closely contested battle fought between Presidency College and Patna College over this man. So 3 years later, he was recalled to Presidency College, but the Patna College proved tougher and more determined. Its principal was a man named C.R. Wilson, who wrested back Jadunath Sarkar. And so from 1902 to 1917, Jadunath Sarkar first served on the chair of English and then on the chair of history at Patna College. But even as these two colleges were squabbling over Jadunath Sarkar, he was thoroughly addicted to Aurangzeb. By writing his path-breaking doctoral thesis, India of Aurangzeb, Sarkar had merely wet his tongue. And for the larger world, he had merely served an appetizer. The full meal was still being prepared in Jadunath Sarkar's well-stocked kitchen of history. And sure enough, he served the first 2 courses of this meal in the same year, that is in July 1912. And that was the year the first 2 volumes of his Magnum opus, The History of Aurangzeb, was published. And like his doctoral thesis, these volumes became an overnight success. They were the first resplendent gems of a future treasure, and the volumes were immediately hailed as the best authority on the subject. There's a famous scholar named Denison Ross. He was a British scholar and historian. He complimented Sarkar, and I quote, for his manner of treating the subject, which might as well serve as a model to writers dealing with the periods of Indo-Musalman history. Close quote. Praise also flooded from Islamic quarters. An Orthodox Muslim scholar, he was a Maulana, a cleric. His name was Maulana Shibli. He was initially angry that Jadunath Sarkar, a Hindu, had dared to write a book about their favorite hero, Aurangzeb. But this Maulana also appreciated Sarkar's wide gamut of learning and scholarship, and over a period of time, the Maulana actually approached Sarkar and helped him in tracing the manuscript of a work called Haft Anjuman, which was finally located in Kashi of all places. But Jadunath Sarkar was indifferent both to fame and fury. He continued his work on the next volume, and the first 2 volumes narrated the history of Aurangzeb from his birth up to the capture of the Mughal throne. And now, Sarkar wanted to understand Aurangzeb as a manifestation of a larger and a more ancient phenomenon operating both in space and time. And Dr. Kwanungo, he explains this very beautifully. Nobody can, replace these words. It's very beautiful, and I'll quote it. Quote, in order to understand a Muslim, one must understand Islam, and the key to Islam lies with Islamic history. Jadunath Sarkar studied Islamic history and culture outside India so that he might do justice to Aurangzeb, who was much less an individual than an ideology that had inspired the Muslim community at every critical period. Close quote. Observe what is happening all around us today. See, I mean, these are words written in gold. They are also warnings that Kwanango and Sarkar have given. So, the last words especially, that it is an ideology that had inspired the Muslim community at every critical period. And Aurangzeb and not Dara Shikoh has won at every critical period in Islamic history. This is exactly happening all around us today. Anyway, that digression apart, he was working on, as I said, he was working on the third volume, but he couldn't wait until the third volume was, fully written and ready for publishing. So what he did was he published some important findings in the same year that the second volume was published. So he published his second volume in July 1912, and in November 1912, just 4 months after the first 2 volumes came out, there was another book titled Anecdotes from Aurangzeb, Historical Essays. This was an English translation of the Persian work Arkam-e-Alamgiri, which was a short biography of Aurangzeb. It has extraordinarily valuable annotations and footnotes by Jadunath Sarkar. It's a must-read work to understand both Aurangzeb and great insights into that period. And at this point, I must also mention what Jadunath Sarkar had done before he published the 2 volumes on Aurangzeb. This story itself gives us a radiant glimpse into the elevating character of Sarkar, of Acharya Jadunath Sarkar. In 1905, Curzon announced the partition of Bengal. We all know the history. And it was basically a sinister move which burnt Bengal and inflamed the whole country against the British. And Jadunath Sarkar naturally was outraged to the core. He decided to fight against it, not by coming down on the streets, but the weapon of his choice was a pen, his pen. Interestingly, one of the elder brothers or younger brother of Jadunath Sarkar, he was working as an engineer in the British government. He was so outraged that he went on, he literally came down to the streets and, he was threatened with dismissal and imprisonment. And after a lot of influence, he managed to retain his job. Anyway, so that is a sidelight on this incident. So the outcome of Jadunath Sarkar's literary fight was a book. Its title was Economics of British India, and it was published in 1909. Its impact was immediate and brutal. Jadunath Sarkar had driven his sword into the weakest organ of the body of the British government, its extortionist economic policy of bleeding India. The book became an instant success throughout the country, and thousands of copies were sold out, and translations were published in different languages in record time. General readers in India were thrilled by Sarkar's irrefutable logic, his data, and the book became a Bhagavad Gita to students of economics. And Jadunath had not majored in economics. Neither was he a lecturer or professor of economics. Even in 1918, that is almost 10 years after the book was first published, even at that time, university students had memorized entire passages and chapters from that book, and they recited them publicly as an act of patriotic defiance against the British. Jadunath Sarkar's vigorous prose also stung the British quite harshly, but they took no action against Sarkar simply because, if they took action, it would mean that they were directly admitting defeat, and more so because they could not simply refute him on facts and logic. So, in a line, Sarkar's book, Economics of British India, it had cornered them, and the government's highest officials had to be, they had to grudgingly praise its merit. And Jadunath wrote this work, Economics of British India, as a symbol of his patriotic protest. It was a protest spread over 400 pages. A protest which became a classic, and he wrote it while he was simultaneously pursuing his studies on Aurangzeb. Remember, the two volumes came out in 1912, and this book came out in 1909. And Economics of British India, it still remains an authority, and today it is a primary source to understand the economic history of the British rule in India. The other good work on British economic policy is Madhushri Mukherjee's Churchill's War on India and Will Durant's Case for India. So these can be read as companion books. So back to our story. Jadunath invested 4 more years of strenuous work before publishing the 3rd volume on Aurangzeb. And when it was finally published in 1916, it created a national controversy for entirely expected reasons. Because the 3rd volume gives the most comprehensive and thorough details of Aurangzeb's all-encompassing bigotry, including his imposition of jizya, his serial jihads against Hindu kings, large-scale temple destructions, and his fanatical oppression and calculated impoverishment of Hindus. These are all backed up by hard data, and this is what the 3rd volume, perhaps the most valuable volume of Jadunath Sarkar's history of Aurangzeb. So these are the details he gave. But more importantly, the book also has an appendix which gives date-wise details of the thousands of temples that Aurangzeb destroyed throughout India. One entire appendix. This is a comprehensive list. And interestingly, despite all this, you know what Kwanungo remarks about this volume? He says, and I quote, that in this volume, Jadunath has touched upon Aurangzeb's temple destruction rather lightly. Close quote. Obviously, the most severe reaction came from the Muslim community. Protest marches were taken out. It's not difficult to offend Muslims. So protest marches were taken out by Muslim communities against Jadunath Sarkar's book, but he remained completely unperturbed. And 3 years later, in July 1919, Jadunath surprised everyone with a book titled Shivaji and His Times. He did not originally plan to write it, and the story behind this book is also pretty interesting. So around 1905, Jadunath Sarkar met a person named Ramananda Chatterjee, and the two of them soon became friends. And in 1907, Ramananda Chatterjee told Jadunath that he was starting a general purpose journal and invited him to contribute to it. And the name of this journal is Modern Review, and it is one of the most learned and illustrious journal that period of modern Indian Renaissance has produced. Its prized archives are still a collector's delight, and it is available freely online. The whole archive, 95% of the archive is available. You can download it freely. And I'll narrate the story of their friendship much later, I think maybe tomorrow. And so from the inception of Modern Review in 1907, Jadunath contributed to it permanently or semi-permanently. One of his initial contributions was a series of essays titled Shivaji Letters. The response to this series was so tremendous that it took a life of its own. And so Sarkar began ransacking every available material on Shivaji, and he breathed life into this great Hindu king. And the series on Shivaji continued for several years, and its final book form was the book I mentioned, Shivaji and His Times. And in the same year, that is in December 1919, Jadunath Sarkar published his 4th volume on Aurangzeb, and I remain awestruck. Was Jadunath Sarkar really a mere human being or a superman? And the 4th volume deals with Aurangzeb's serial campaigns in South India, or rather in the Deccan, and his various encounters with Shivaji. And a student of Jadunath Sarkar, he describes the fourth volume quite delightfully, and I quote, "Thus Shivaji and Aurangzeb confronted each other on the shelf of reviewers and scholars who were competent enough to pronounce judgment on both of them." Close quote. And one such reviewer was the veteran scholar of history, Henry Beveridge. And this is what Beveridge says, and I quote, "Jadunath may be called the primus in India as the user of Persian authorities for the history of India. He might also be styled as the Gibbon of Bengal." Close quote. And Jadunath took this praise in the same spirit that he had taken the furious Muslim condemnation for the third volume, serene indifference. And Jadunath devoted the next 5 years of his life working on the fifth and the final volume of the history of Aurangzeb. His zeal, passion, patience and dedication remained undimmed throughout this period, but his work on the fifth volume was rudely interrupted. It came in the form of a request from the daughter of a dead British ICS officer. The name of this officer was William Irvine. He was a distinguished historian of the Mughal period, and he shot to fame with his most famous work. It was the English translation of the work of Niccolo Manucci, who was an Italian traveler who wrote eyewitness accounts of Shah Jahan and Jahangir, which Dr. S.L. Bhairappa has also used in Avarana. And after his retirement, William Irvine began working on a comprehensive history of the Mughal period after Aurangzeb's death. This manuscript was titled Later Mughals. But Irvine died in 1911 before he could complete the manuscript, and his daughter found the unfinished manuscript and whole trunks full of research material. And unwilling to let go of, waste all this valuable research, she searched both Europe and India for the best scholar to complete this work. And finally, she found Jadunath Sarkar, Yatha Vrikshasya Sampushpitasya. Again, he immediately agreed not only to edit the manuscript, but to publish it as well at his own cost. And this episode is just one among the countless examples of his majestic altruism. But editing William Irvine's manuscript proved to be an uphill task for several reasons. Like it is said that, it is always easier to rewrite, a work from the scratch than correct the mistakes of other people. Anyway, so, so it proved to be an uphill task for various reasons. And again, I will invoke Dr. Konungo. He narrates the whole process. Nobody can match it. And I quote, "Jadunath Sarkar was at sea with the mass of papers and notes bristling with dates and references, many of them beyond his immediate reach. And he was not accustomed to take anything on trust where history was concerned. So he had to get photographs and transcripts of all the original authorities. His knowledge of Marathi, other indigenous and foreign sources was brought to bear upon the period of Irvine's specialized history, which had been based mainly on Persian sources. Such a Herculean task was completed in a manner that might have surprised Irvine himself if he could have risen from the grave. Jadunath checked every date, amended authorities, and clipped off unwieldy, though learned footnotes. He himself added 3 chapters to bring out the story of the invasion of Nadir Shah. On this enlarged historical canvas appeared the Sikhs and Jats, the Bundelas and the Marathas, with a background of the early history of each. A man without the fine sense of literary proportions possessed by Jadunath would have been lost in the jungle in the attempt to edit such a book. Once Jadunath humorously remarked that if he had not used his discretion in omitting what Irvine had written against the Sikh community, he would have become a martyr in his own lifetime. Close quote. The final work, titled Later Mughals, was published by Jadunath Sarkar in 1922 in 2 volumes, and as always, it received instant praise and critical acclaim from every scholar and reviewer who read it. And I will read out just 2 sample reviews. One, no competent and authority than Professor Jadunath Sarkar could have been found to edit Irvine's lifetime's work. The work derives a broad pathway through a very tangled jungle. It clears up many disputed points. It throws a flood of light on the manners, customs, and characters of the time, and certainly will always remain one of the chief authorities of the period. Close quote. But there was also a sublime element that only Jadunath Sarkar could bring to this work. And it's a very moving thing to narrate here. And this is a short biography of William Irvine that Jadunath Sarkar wrote at the beginning of the book. Sarkar writes it with a genuine respect for Irvine's scholarship, and he sketches a largely sympathetic portrait of the man. Remember, he was an officer of the British Empire, an empire meant to extort and enslave India. So, ನಿಜವಾದ ಸಾರಸ್ವತ ಇದಕ್ಕೆ ಕೃಷಿಗೆ ಸರ್ವಿಸ್ಗೆ Jadunath Sarkar gave his recognition. But even the other important thing is that even if Sarkar had not written William Irvine's biography, nobody would have complained or objected. And not just that, he also gives a comprehensive bibliography of William Irvine's work. ಇದು ಮಾಡಬೇಕಾಗಿದ್ದ ಅಗತ್ಯನೇ ಇರಲಿಲ್ಲ. So that work was published, like I said, it opened to critical acclaim. And the 5th and the final volume on Aurangzeb was published in 1924. And although Jadunath Sarkar had already been recognized as an authority on Aurangzeb by that time, the final volume was a conclusive stamp that sealed his authority. It had consumed 25 years of his life, and Dr. Kwanungo, he describes this epochal achievement in a dramatic and enthralling fashion, and I quote, "With the publication of his last volume on Aurangzeb, the historian at last comes out of the wood, takes a panoramic view of it, and falls into a pensive mood of philosophic contemplation over this tragedy in 5 acts of the drama." Close quote. This is tapas in its purest form. And with that, we can come to a close of today's session, because, you know, if I start what I have to plan for tomorrow, I'll have to leave it unfinished, have to complete only like 5 or 10% of it. 5 volumes is about roughly 2,500, 3,000 pages. So I think with that we can, call it a day today. And I once again thank the Gokhale Institute of Public Affairs and Shashikiran and all its staff here for providing this opportunity. And my thanks also goes out to all of you in this audience. Namaste.